Hello, I'm Kate Chabot. Welcome to Sitrep, your weekly look at the big issues in defence and world affairs. A cyber attack against the Armed Forces payroll system has potentially compromised the personal data of more than 270,000 service personnel and veterans.
I can confirm to the House that we do have indications that this was the suspected work of a malign actor, and we cannot rule out state involvement.
While the Defence Secretary will only talk about a malign actor, pretty much everyone else is pointing the finger at China.
If this data breach is found to be carried out by a hostile state, it would represent a very serious threat to our national security.
So what would an enemy want to do with names, addresses and bank details of servicemen and women? Mike and I will talk through the many questions with former Army Intelligence Officer Colonel Philip Ingram and Ciaran Martin, who was the first Chief Executive of the National Cyber Security Centre. Also on Sitrep, is Georgia turning away from Nato and the EU in favour of Russia? Tens of thousands of protesters think so.
Anything's possible. Even the idea, of course, of a sort of Ukraine-style scenario where we have a revolution, where we have people who are prepared to set up tent cities in the capital.
And when is a knife not a knife? We delve into the history of military pocket tools as the most iconic introduces a blade-free version.
Sitrep with Kate Chabot and Professor Michael Clarke.
Being Defence Secretary is never an easy job. There are much harder and more significant tasks than the one Grant Shapps had to do when he faced MPs about this data breach. But I can't imagine, Mike, there are many tasks that are more embarrassing than that.
No, and I mean, too often Secretaries of State for Defence have to go to the Commons and explain something that's gone wrong. I mean, the MOD's got a better story to tell than most people think. 46 billion annual budget, 250,000 people work there, but lots and lots of contractors. And the MOD, because of the nature of what it does, uses a lot of contractors. And when things go wrong, everything goes back to main building MOD, and the Secretary of State has to go and say something about it. So it's not a nice thing to do. It is embarrassing, but we have to keep these things in perspective. This has been a breach, undoubtedly, and it's serious, but there are certainly worse things that might happen in the defence business which don't.
Well, let's just briefly run through some key points. It was a contractor's computer system that was hacked, not the MOD's own computers. The JPA system was not affected. The data includes names, service numbers and bank details. In a small number of cases, addresses may be involved, and the MOD is writing to all those people. The Ministry of Defence says there is no evidence that data has been compromised, exploited or published online. And there's much more information available to serving personnel on the Defence Connect website, including a dedicated support phone number and email address. You can also find those in the description of this week's Sitrep podcast. So let's bring in our guest, Ciaran Martin, founding Chief Executive of the National Cyber Security Centre, and Philip Ingram, former Army Intelligence Officer. Welcome to both of you. Ciaran, you understand cyber security intimately. You also understand the language of Whitehall. When ministers say there is no evidence or no indication that data was stolen, should we take confidence from that, or is it PR speak for not sure?
It's hard to say, particularly the no data is stolen line. I mean, when you deal with data breaches, the data remains there. So it's not like a conventional physical theft where there's an item and if it gets stolen, it's not there anymore. When data is accessed illicitly, then it can be copied. So obviously the payroll data is still there, and the Ministry of Defence have quite rightly said everybody's going to get paid. There's no impact on that critical service for armed forces personnel. But I think the underlying assumption is that whoever has perpetrated this operation, no doubt we'll come back to that, has access to this data. But I think Michael Clarke has very helpfully started us off by saying, let's keep this in perspective. We have, you mentioned the language of cybersecurity. There's a phrase which is used specifically in cybersecurity, borrowed from other walks of life, called the crown jewel data sets, things that are really, really important. Now, this is an important data set, but it's not a crown jewel. I'll give you a very specific contrast from 9 years ago, and I think defence personnel will really relate to this. 9 years ago, the American government said that they were convinced that the Chinese state had walked off with the federal government's security clearance database. The CIA don't use it, but everybody else, including lots of sensitive organizations, do use it. Now, anybody, and of course loads of people, will have filled in developed vetting forms. Think about the data in a developed vetting form and contrast it with your bank details. A developed vetting form is a rich tapestry that compromises your entire identity for life. Right? This is not that. So I think what happened to the Americans was a massive strategic setback in 2015. I think this is something that's obviously of use to a potential hostile state actor, but it's not on the same scale. I would characterize it as serious, but at the lower end of serious, and no cause for absolute panic amongst those affected.
And Philip, forces personnel are constantly warned to keep their personal information secure. How worried would you be if your name, service number and bank details had been on that system?
Well, I'd be slightly concerned, and it's knowing where the full detail's going out. But there is so much detail published out about individuals within service life, and all of that is being hoovered up. And if this is the Chinese, and I suspect it probably is, they, of all nations, hoover everything up that they can to store in their massive databases so that they can then begin to use that to build their wider intelligence pictures. So they don't mind what they get. This is good stuff for them because it's giving them an understanding of the numbers of people in the military, from the amount they're being paid, and their ranks. They can work out roughly where their positions are. And therefore, for a hostile intelligence service, this is, good stuff. But it's what we would expect the Chinese to be doing. And, they've gone into what, in cybersecurity terms, is called a supply chain attack. They've attacked one of the areas of the Ministry of Defence which is weakest. And it's a bit that's not directly under their control. It's part of the supply chain of the services being supplied into MOD.
Mike, why won't the government point the finger at China? And if it isn't Beijing, who else could it be?
Well, I think the government doesn't want to appear reckless in what it says. It's being very cautious, very evidence-based, and there's always room for some element of doubt. If it's not China, it would be Russia, since most cyber attacks on Britain originate in Russia somewhere or through Russian involvement. But the rest of us are pretty sure this has got to be China, because it's what they do. As Philip said, they hoover up everything they can, and then they can cross-check. They can actually, the more databases they can get, basic information, they can cross-check people's names and addresses and numbers and availability and so on. And 10 or 15 years ago, when we knew they were doing this, we always used to say to ourselves, why would they do this? I mean, they've got so much information, surely they can't use it. And of course, these days, with AI tools, yes, they can. They can put AI onto it, and they'll give them a very nuanced version of who everybody is. And so they hoover up absolutely everything. And, I've got direct experience of that from when I was running RUSI. They kept attacking us, trying to get hold of our database. They never got it, but it cost me a lot of money on several occasions to keep protecting it, because they just wanted the details of people who were trying to come to our conferences and who were interested in RUSI affairs. As I say, they were our crown jewels, as Ciaran said. Our crown jewels were our members and our conference attendees. They never got that information, but my goodness, it cost me a lot of money to stop them getting it.
And Ciaran, why might a hostile state want to hoover it all up, seemingly fairly bland data? How might it be used exactly?
Well, if it's okay, I might come back in a few points. Firstly, on the point you made about the damage done, I think there is one thing in the government's statement which is true, which is it's not being dumped on the dark web, and actually a nation state was unlikely to do that. It'll want to keep it for itself, and actually in terms of criminals do that all the time, but in terms of the security and safety of British personnel, that's actually a bit of a silver lining here. I'll also, in terms of why the government hasn't said anything, I'll do something unfashionable and stick up for them. Under data protection law, you have to tell people as soon as possible when they've been compromised in these large numbers. There's no compelling national security reason to delay that, so they had to come to Parliament. Attribution, as Mike says, you want to be careful, and you probably want to do it with allies. So it wouldn't surprise me if a few months down the line they come out and say this was a nation state attack, and they might specify who it is. So I don't think that story is closed yet, but it's right that they take time. Why might they want to do it? I don't know much to add to what Mike said. I think building up a picture And as Philip said, it's not just of military personnel, although I think they'd be more interested in those than the average British citizen. With the amount of tools, not just available now with AI, but coming down the line with quantum, they are looking at population level data sets. So, I mean, it's a month ago we were talking about the Electoral Commission breach, which I think was quite a bizarre and probably quite poor Chinese operation, because the Electoral Commission, most of it is freely available and the rest you can buy for a modest sum of money. So why they spent 2 years of elite nation-state resources hacking it is beyond me. But that tells you something about the motives. I think the government probably incorrectly positioned that as an attack on our electoral system. It's actually, they want to understand the British population and particularly the sensitive aspects of that. So maybe this data set sits there for a while and they can't use it very much, but then they match it to something else and then they match it to something else. And all of a sudden, they know quite a lot about British service personnel. They can look at exploiting vulnerable people. They can look at what type of people are going in. They can look at whether they think our manpower figures are true. They can look at who's where, etc., etc. So it's building block, and they're patient and they play a long game.
And they might potentially look at service personnel who are financially vulnerable to being approached.
Yeah. Now, again, let's keep that in perspective. And people can understand this, if I owe you a tenner and you give me your bank details, I can pay you a tenner, but I can't access your bank and start spending your money, and I can't see your bank statements. You have to do a bit more on that, but it's certainly a starting point. And then you can look at, and maybe you can do some identity impersonation, because I know your name, I know where you work, and I know your service number, I know where you bank, so I might be able to spoof my way into your bank account. But again, that takes more effort, and effort is finite. So there is something to be concerned about, but it's not as simple as, oh, our bank details are gone, so automatically they know who's financially vulnerable. But they will be interested in who's financially vulnerable. Of course they will.
Philip, you've experienced a recruitment attempt by Chinese intelligence on social media before now. What happened to you?
Yes, it was a couple of years ago, and there's an article published in the Times about it. I was approached in what seemed to be a legitimate business approach on LinkedIn. Now, my profile on LinkedIn is what I recommend people with my background not to do. I've openly described what I did and who I am and everything else. But this was asking me to go and present a paper at a conference in China, and I present papers at conferences around the world. But having run counterintelligence operations across the globe and knowing my profile would attract attention, there were a few things about the approach that made me suspicious. So I played along with it for a little bit, gathering more information from the individual that had approached me, understanding what it was that he wanted and how he was going to pay me and everything else. And that just, the more I sought from him, rang more and more alarm bells. And it got to the point where, I was 99% certain that this was not a business approach. It was a hostile intelligence approach, and then managed to get that information passed to the appropriate authorities, who have incorporated part of my story into a booklet that they produce, and the appropriate authorities, their front end is the National Protective Security Authority, NPSA, and they've got a fantastic booklet called Think Before You Link, and part of my story is encapsulated in with other stories. There's a bit of poetic license putting two or three together, but it's a very good reminder for people.
Mike, the Defence Secretary spent 3/4 of an hour talking to MPs about this. From your perspective, did it cover all the ground, or did it still leave big unanswered questions?
Well, I thought that the Defence Secretary covered all the ground he could at the time. The big question behind it all, of course, is contractors. Every department in government deals with contractors, and some departments, like the Home Office and the MOD, deal with a lot of contractors, and contractors deal with contractors. And so there's this whole supply chain where you think to yourself, well, who are the caterers who provide the catering for the security people? And the security people come onto the site, and the manager of the security company has a meeting with the site management, and the site management chair is somebody who works for the MOD itself. And so, by 3 and 4 removes, you can get into systems that get you inside the site. Indeed, there was a famous, reputedly a famous case in the United States of a big defense site that was hacked into through the streetlights outside, through the computing system that control the on-off of the streetlights. So the worry always in these cases are the contractors and this long supply chain of services which any sensitive operation needs to have.
Ciaran, what kind of questions will be asked right now or being asked right now about the contractors, and what kind of investigations will be going on?
Very much agree with what Michael Clarke has just said. I think, firstly, it depends how fundamental you want to get. And I think, given this, I think we should look quite fundamentally at some of these issues. So there are questions for the Ministry of Defence as well. I mean, the first and obvious question, and I think you should approach this fairly neutrally rather than in a sort of blame game type of way, is what services in the light of this type of threat is it appropriate to contract out versus what you should keep in-house. And that's not a straightforward question, because of course one of the other silver linings in this case is the fact that it was a contractor meant that there was no wider access to Ministry of Defence assets because it was a self-contained private database. On the other hand, if you are going to contract things out, you have to have a threshold, because there will be some things. I mean, I mentioned earlier the American case, and certainly, with very sensitive intelligence or vetting databases, you'll want to probably keep those in-house. But on the other hand, when you do have to contract things out, and as Mike says, you have to contract something out, it's just not plausible, it's not practical to develop, a huge defence establishment without some form of involvement of the private sector. What oversight are you going to have? How are you going to exercise it? How are you going to frame the contracts? How are you going to learn the lessons? How are you going to apply standards to ensure that the contractor abides by the highest standards? What penalties are you going to impose, etc., etc.? These are all very, very difficult questions. Obviously, they're also not unique to defence, and not all sensitive things in the British state are in the defence part of government. So it's a government-wide problem as well. And I would encourage the government to look not just at not to confine this process to the Ministry of Defence, but to look across everything sensitive.
And Philip, how can individuals contribute to damage limitation if this data was taken or even gets published?
Well, I think individuals just need to be vigilant as to what's going on. Building an intelligence picture is like the picture that people are looking at on their screens at the moment. It's built pixel by pixel at a time, or colour by colour that's making up the pixel at each time. And the more data that they've got, the more that picture can be built up, depending on the question that's being asked. So service personnel should be watching out for unusual approaches through social media, unusual activities around some of their financial transactions and anything else, and not be afraid to report it. I'm hoping that the advice that's been given on the defence network is giving people a helpline to be able to report things into, because that then allows our intelligence services to pick up and build that picture of who might be threatening it, who might be using this data. And I have to agree with Ciaran completely. It's a good thing if this is a nation state and not a criminal gang, because the data, if it appeared on the dark web, would be much more serious from a security perspective to service personnel.
Colonel Philip Ingram, Ciaran Martin, thank you very much for your time. And there is much more advice and contact details for support for service personnel who may be affected on Defence Connect. Those contact details are also in the description of this week's Sitrep podcast.
News, discussions and analysis. This is Sitrep.
NATO describes Georgia as one of its closest partners. Indeed, there's been talk, though no real action, about Georgia joining the alliance and also possibly the EU ever since Russia invaded in 2008. But Georgia's government is now showing signs it may be turning away from liberal Europe and towards Moscow. A foreign agents law currently passing through Parliament has prompted weeks of mass protests branded by opponents as a page from the Kremlin's playbook. Mike, we'll explain all those events a bit more in a moment. But how concerned are you by what is happening in Georgia right now?
Yeah, I'm very concerned because I think this happened last year. It's happening again in a rerun this year. And this foreign agents law will go through, because the Georgia Dream Party has a majority in the parliament, not by many. It's got, I think it's 83 seats out of 150. But it will go through. It's in its third reading now. And when it does, we will see what happens next. But Georgia is on the verge of either falling into the Russian sphere through its present government, or a revolution, rather like the Rose Revolution and the Orange Revolution that occurred in Ukraine. So it is very sensitive. And because there's so much else going on in the world, in Ukraine and in Gaza, a lot of people have not been taking enough notice of it. I think we should pay more attention to what's going on in Georgia.
Well, let's bring in Robin Forrestier-Walker, a British journalist now living and working in the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi. Robin, great to have you on Sitrep. Thank you for your time. So what is this foreign agents law and why has it brought tens of thousands of protesters onto the streets?
So if you look at the law itself, what it is effectively a tool, a blunt instrument to stigmatize and potentially criminalize the NGOs here that play a very critical role in holding this government to account. They've made no secret, the government, of their dislike for one or two NGOs in particular that are very effective at writing about corruption, high-level corruption here amongst officials. And also, one of them will be crucial in helping to keep an eye on the elections which will be taking place here in October. So they will be doing election monitoring. Just to get to the second point, which is that they've done this for themselves. On the other hand, are they also doing this with pressure coming from the Kremlin? And that's the question people are asking here. And I think the opposition movement on the streets are absolutely convinced that this is about Vladimir Putin's Russia putting pressure on Georgia to show that it's loyal and obedient and is not going down the European path.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about these NGOs? Are we talking about European NGOs specifically?
Well, these are NGOs that receive a significant part of their funding from the EU or from individual states like the UK. The Foreign Office also contributes significant funds and support here for the non-governmental sector, the non-profits, and also, of course, the United States, the State Department, USAID. They all have been very supportive of these organizations, these NGOs over the years.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the political dynamics of this? Because polling suggests the vast majority of Georgians would like to join the EU and NATO.
And that's still the case. Most Georgians think that their future belongs in Europe. And they also would like to see themselves as part of NATO. I think the Ukraine war that Russia has launched against Ukraine has really changed the status quo. There are huge fears that Georgia could get caught up in this war. And the government and its supporters and the kinds of people that they are using as proxies, whether that's through their trolls on social media and so forth, have been playing this line heavily that really, it's not Russia that's the risk. We're doing everything we can to try to balance ourselves. We don't want to be seen as too pro-European. We certainly don't want to be seen as too pro-Russian, but we're doing everything to stop what they describe as a party of war, trying to create a second front in Georgia. And this idea is that the Western partners would be only too happy to see Georgia somehow brought into this conflict with Russia. And of course, that argument has caused great consternation in Brussels and Washington. On the contrary, it's Russia that is most likely to want to start another war here. It has military bases in South Ossetia, occupied territory that is internationally part of Georgia. Those bases are within tens of kilometers or less from the main highway that runs east-west in Georgia. Russian tanks could be on that highway and literally severing this country in two within a matter of hours. So that's just gives you an idea about how people are afraid, of course, that Georgia could get dragged into a conflict with Russia. But it seems at the moment that Russia has Georgia exactly where it wants it to be.
So what effect have the protests had, and what is the atmosphere like now?
I mean, it's feverish. Everybody I speak to of a certain age and let's say profile, you know, the capital of Tbilisi has probably half the population, educated, middle class, liberal people here who absolutely see this for what it is. They say, of course, that this is a Russian law. That's why they're coming out to say no. And we've seen this repeatedly now over the last 3 weeks. Big demonstrations, especially when the government or when the authorities use heavy-handed tactics like tear gas, pepper spray, water cannon or just beating people, grabbing them off the streets, beating them, throwing them in the back of police vans and detaining them. And each time it seems the opposition is willing to come out and show in serious numbers. I've not seen a protest movement this large in the entire time I've been reporting on this region here in Georgia in 10 years. It's certainly by far and away the largest organic grassroots movement, but we just don't know really how far either side is prepared to go. But anything's possible. Even the idea, of course, of a sort of Ukraine-style scenario where we have a revolution, where we have people who are prepared to set up tent cities in the capital that are prepared to fight back against heavy-handed police tactics, keep coming out, and it becomes untenable for this government to hold on without some form of compromise. Any of these scenarios are possible, really.
Robin, we shall watch with great interest. Thank you very much for informing us. Thank you for your time. Mike, do you think this really could go the way of Ukraine, the 2014 Maidan revolution, which ultimately led to the first Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea?
Yes, exactly. As we were just discussing there, it could. It could go in lots of different ways. There's a family I know who lived in Kherson in Ukraine. And when Kherson was was about to be occupied by the Russians, they moved out and they went to live in Georgia. And I've kept up with them. And the father wrote to me quite recently, and he said, every morning I wake up and the Russians haven't invaded or the Georgians haven't told us to leave, I think it's a good day and I get up and go about my day. That sense of tension is absolutely palpable. That one day they may wake up and the Russians have invaded, as we were saying there, it could happen within hours, or that the Georgian government could take a massive turn towards authoritarianism and start throwing people out or whatever, or there could be another version of the original Rose Revolution in Georgia, like the Orange Revolution in Ukraine itself. So all things are possible. And something is going to happen, because when this bill goes through, as I said, which it will, the president, Salome Nurabishvili, she's against it, and she said she won't sign it. And we'll see what happens. She said last year she wouldn't sign a bill like that. The bill was withdrawn. When it comes back to her this time, we'll see what she does. But that will be a critical moment, and it's going to happen fairly soon.
And as we just heard, Russia has military bases in occupied Georgian territory, but NATO has a joint training and evaluation centre in Georgia as part of cooperation with the country. How much further can the alliance let this go before something has to change? Well,
that will depend. NATO is helping Georgia get onto the path of Partnership for Peace to eventually join NATO. That will be a very eventually. And the Russians not only have bases in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the two breakaway republics, just like Luhansk and Donetsk in the Donbass, self-declared breakaway republics. The Russians are even building a naval base in Abkhazia on the Black Sea. Because they've been thrown out of the western part of the Black Sea, they're relocating to Novorossiya in Russia itself and to this new base in Abkhazia in Georgia. So the Russians are investing in the part of about 20% of Georgia they already control. And if they decide to move further, then the fact that we've got a NATO mission there will be very, very awkward. If it withdraws, that would be a very big symbol. If it doesn't withdraw, then the possibility of, let's say, militarized confrontation is also very high. It'd be a very big pressure point.
And while we're on the subject of Russia and what's going on with the UK expelling the Russian defence attaché as an undeclared intelligence officer, it raises two questions. Do we really have an official route for declaring spies? And don't we just assume all foreign defence attachés are gathering intelligence to some extent?
Yes, they are, and that's understood. And we do it in friendly countries as well. So a defence attaché, say in our defence attaché in Germany or in Italy, their job is to maintain liaison, but to report back to London on, well, this is where the armed forces seem to be going. These are their plans. This is what we understand of their latest white paper. And that's what they do all the time, and that's entirely legitimate. Defence attachés are expected to draw in as it were, open source intelligence and understand it and send it back to their capital. But there's also an implicit assumption that you don't overstep those boundaries. Or if you do overstep them, you only overstep them a little bit. And what seems to have happened here is that the boundaries have been overstepped by quite a lot. It sounds to me as if they were warned, that they ignored the warning, and so the Foreign Office have now said, OK, well, that's it, you're out. I mean, the Home Office have made the decision. The Foreign Office obviously were part of it. And in this case, I think the overstepping of the boundaries, whatever they were significant and against previous warnings, because normally there's a quite a good understanding of how defence attachés go about their business.
Now, finally this week, an update to a tool that has been carried in countless soldiers' pockets for well over a century. The Swiss Army knife is getting versions without a blade. The makers say it gives customers new options amid tighter knife laws. Of course, the Swiss Army knife has never officially been issued to British soldiers, the clue's in the name, but the National Army Museum has a collection of many other pocket tools that they've carried, maybe alongside their own personal Swiss Army knife. Curator Julian Farrance has been telling me why it's so iconic.
I suppose it's an ubiquitous tool that's been around forever, and it's become synonymous with multi-use tools and in compact forms. It's become multifunctional. It's like, for instance, the use of the term hoover when you're talking about vacuum cleaners, because it's just something that's easily identifiable. But it's not something that was ever issued to British soldiers. So we had many things that were issued to British soldiers that would approximate what Swiss Army knives do, but we never actually had Swiss Army knives issued.
So what did the British soldiers get exactly?
Crikey. Well, I mean, you could go through many, many thousands of different iterations of what British soldiers have been issued with, but there's lots of examples of small little bits of kit which they would deem to be useful, whether that was issued by the army or whether they went and decided to just go and buy it for themselves. So a good example of that, for instance, would be identification discs. So ID discs that soldiers get. Now, that's something that the army issues to them because it's a really necessary piece of kit. But the initial ones, the first versions of those were made in something called vulcanized fiber, which is cardboard to me and you. And they're supposed to be burn-proof and rot-proof, and they're neither because we've tested, and soldiers were fully aware of that. So they would tend to go and buy their own. They would get little metal ones made up, which they would then have on bracelets around their wrists, so that they have then got the comfort of knowing that if they are killed, that there will always be a way of identifying them. So that's an interesting idea there, that there are things that are being issued, but then things that people would like to buy for themselves.
I mean, the Swiss Army knife has become a catch-all term. Troops love a good gadget, don't they?
Yeah, and that goes back way back. So we've got examples of interesting gadgets that soldiers have been carrying right back to the 17th century. If you'll indulge me, I've got a few little examples here. So this is actually the first use of the word spanner. So that comes from the 17th century, the time of the English Civil War.
It's about the size of a spoon, right?
Yeah, it's like a little tiny thing about the size of a spoon with a lock on one end that you can put onto the wheel of the wheel lock and wind it up and tighten up the spring that way. And that would be used by soldiers who carried a specific sort of weapon, a wheel lock weapon, which is a kind of ignition system for how do you fire the gun. That needed to be wound up. It's a sort of clockwork gun. So you would need a spanner to wind it up because you would span the lock. You would wind it up that way. And a clever soldier, therefore, would have this hanging around his neck on a bit of thong, and he could wind up his pistol and make it go bang. So that kind of thing, most people would look at that and go, haven't got a clue what that is. But a soldier of the 17th century would go, I know what that is.
Go on, what else you got?
Oh, well, I've got some interesting things. I've got bullet mold, which looks like a pair of pliers. Now, that's a bit later. That's from the Napoleonic Wars. And all soldiers would carry one of these because if they ran out of bullets and because they were campaigning for a long time, say, for instance, we've got soldiers in the Peninsular War, famously at the time of Lieutenant Sharp and his green jackets and rifles, lots of soldiers would be issued with ammunition, but if they ever ran out, they could use this to make more. So you just need find some lead, and then you could melt it on the fire, and you could use this mold to make more bullets. So that's a sort of, like I say, it's a fairly lengthy sort of set of pliers. It's got a little shaver on there to cut off any of the flux or sprue. And there we go. So that's a nice little Napoleonic thing. And again, if you showed that to people outside of a museum today, they go, I haven't got a clue. If I could put that on QI and go, what do you think that is, lads? And they wouldn't have the first
You said earlier that Swiss Army and the knife is beyond your brief at the British Army Museum. What did British troops do? What was the British version of the Swiss Army knife?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So through the 19th and into the 20th century, British soldiers were being issued with clasp knives. And they are basically, this is not private purchase. This is something that you would be issued with. So this is actually from the First World War. And this has a nice sharp blade on it, because that's always handy. The other thing it's got is just a big sort of metal spike, which most people would say, oh, I know what that's for. That's for getting stones out of horses' hooves. And I suppose you can use it for that, but that's not what it's actually designed for. It's got a marlin spike, and it's supposed to be used to pick apart rope. Why British soldiers really needed to be able to pick apart rope, I couldn't tell you. I suspect that's possibly a naval element, so they might be using the same sort of knife that sailors were wearing. But I don't actually know if that's the case. But there we are. So that would have been used throughout the First World War, and then shorter versions of that in the Second World War.
And to be fair, that really just looks like a penknife.
Well, again, why is a penknife called a penknife? Because it was a knife that you would need to cut stems into your goose quills to make pens, and then it just would have in your pocket. So all handy knives that you had in your pocket were just pen knives. But the army, being very descriptive about things like that, would never call that our knife a penknife. This is a clasp knife because it clasps closed.
Julian Farrance, thank you very much.
Most welcome.
Now, the eagle-eared among you may have noticed Julian was actually showing me some of those historic pocket tools. If you want to watch our conversation and see them for yourself, head over to @BFBS Sitrep on X. Mike, service personnel certainly like a good multi-tool. Leatherman seems to be the brand of choice these days. Others are available. Do you think there's a future for a knifeless Swiss Army knife?
Not really. I think, as you said, the clue is in the title, isn't it? A Swiss Army knife. And I remember as a boy, I played with my dad's clasp knife that he brought home from the war for years and years and years, big heavy thing. And I loved it because it did so many different things, or seemed to anyway. And the army is in love with these things. And of course, there is a concept in the army of a Swiss Army knife wife. Very important, a Swiss Army knife wife.
Can you clear up the mystery? Did British soldiers have to unpick rope? Any idea?
No, I think, as we said, that's a naval thing. I mean, that spike, which I remember playing with a lot of the time, was useful for all sorts of things, but picking apart rope is probably not one of them. There are occasions when you need to get hold of a piece of rope and unpick it, but that's something that happens on ships more than happens on land.
Enough said. Mike, thank you so much. And thanks to all of our guests this week. That is it until next Thursday. Until then, you can always catch up with past programmes you might have missed online at bfbs.com/sitrep, the Forces News YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.